Welcome to Future Talk. Today's program is about the Millennium Project. It's a global network of futurists and other thinkers who are operating in more than 50 different countries trying to resolve the world's most pressing problems. I have two guests. Brock Hinzmann is the chairman of the Millennium Project Silicon Valley node. He spent over 30 years at SRI International, which is one of the world's top scientific research organizations. He's proficient in many branches of technology and is considered an expert in anticipating future trends. He describes himself as a technology navigator. Charles Ostman is a longtime participant in the Millennium Project. He's also director of special projects at a company called General Hydroponics, which he co-founded. He has broad experience in the fields of electronics, physics, and material science, including at Los Alamos National Laboratory and Lawrence Berkeley Lab. He's written extensively about the convergence of biotechnology and nanotechnology. Brock, what exactly is the mission of the Millennium Project? How would you define its purpose?
Well, as you pointed out, it's a global network of people who are doing futures research of various kinds. And the main purpose is to address 15 global challenges that the Millennium Project originally identified as part of a United Nations project in 1996, leading up to the turn of the millennium, hence the Millennium Project. So they are also promoting best practices in futures research, using horizon scanning, scenarios projects, real-time Delphis, and they actually produce a compendium of nearly 40 different futures methods for looking at the future, and publish that every year.
Is the goal to make policy recommendations to decision makers?
The goal is to help policymakers find good policies by making them aware of all of the issues that can affect any given policy, and so that's incorporated in these 15 global challenges. So it's easy enough to say, well, we want to solve one issue like the availability of water or women's issues or energy issues, but in fact we try to help them realize that these issues are all interconnected and you need to solve them together as an integrated whole rather than just one.
Now, I believe that we have a slide which shows some of the organizations that support the Millennium Project. Can we see that slide, please?
Right. This slide is designed to show something that the Millennium Project has come to think of as a way to approach these problems using trans institutions. In other words, any one problem, again, not only has many different aspects to it, but it's difficult for any one entity to solve that problem. So it's not just a government policy decision. You need banking involved in some situations. You need non-governmental organizations involved. You need various other kinds of institutions to work together as a kind of trans institution that is not limited by the policies or the politics of any good.
Now the slide listed a number of types of organizations that are involved: governments, non-government organizations, universities, the United Nations. Is there any one group that's more of a driving force behind it than the others?
I don't think there's any one group that's the main driving force, but as you look at projects that are funded, where the actual funding comes from, you can see groups like the Rockefeller Foundation gets involved. UNESCO has funded several projects. But in each country, it can be quite different. A different local or national government agency in that country, or in some cases, they're funded by commercial companies.
If I may interject, I think it's also a moving target because, target may not be the right word, but there was a traditional model, almost like a top-down model. You have these giant projects and, the multinational banks that come in, World Bank and so forth. And I think that's kind of fading away, and I think what you're seeing is a much more granular approach. The Nobel Prize was awarded to Muhammad, I can't remember his first name, who developed the microeconomics model. That
Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Prize economist.
That's correct. And the whole idea was to change from these big top-down structures to much more granular, sort of bottom-up ways of approaching these, as Brock so correctly points out, these sort of complex but interconnected processes, so that small entities really could have a stake in what they're doing and actually have a much more hands-on approach to how they reckon with these processes. And that's a very different approach than what things have been maybe 2 decades ago or even a decade ago.
So it's less top-down and more bottom-up?
I would say so. That's how I see it.
Right. Yeah, I actually agree with that. One of the things that the Silicon Valley node of the Millennium Project got involved in was the early days of the Singularity University. And there you see a model where rather than teaching from the top down, you try to encourage people, you teach by learning how to address a problem. So it's learning by solving rather than just telling people what the past has been. And I think this kind of approach is more granular. Then you get people looking to these challenges and figuring out, okay, if I'm going to solve this problem, it has to be a sustainable solution. So I have to develop a business model, or I have to develop some way for it to sustain itself beyond the traditional model of, oh, let's just get some funding from the World Bank.
And these models have to have some kind of synergy that interconnect with each other, so that you have different sorts of solution sets, but they all sort of cross-connect. And that's, again, is a very different way of looking at things than what it had been perhaps in previous times.
Now, I understand that the Millennium Project is working on what it calls 15 global challenges.
Right.
And obviously, we don't have time to discuss 15 global challenges, but I'm hoping we'll get to discuss 2. And one of them is peace and conflict issues, which you know a lot about. And one of them is agricultural sustainability, which you know a lot about. So let's start with peace and conflict. It looks like there's an increasing number of conflicts in the world that don't appear to have any kind of peaceful resolution. What is the approach of the Millennium Project in dealing with those kind of issues?
Well, I think what we found in some of the futures methods, like generative dialogue, where you get people to sit down who maybe have a conflict that appears to be unresolvable, but if you go through a dialogue with the issues, you find that they have some common things that they can build upon. And so the way the Millennium Project works with that is we do some background research. We develop what we call a real-time Delphi. So a Delphi study is where you have a list of questions. You get experts to answer those questions as to how they would affect a desirable outcome. Let's say peace in the future happens. And so what are the factors that we need to address to make that scenario turn out one way or a different way?
Now, does that assume that both sides want to live peacefully? Sometimes you have a situation where one side says, I want what you've got, and I know that you're not going to give it to me, so I'm going to have to take it away by force.
That seems like the way things have we've tried to do things in the past, and obviously that isn't working very well. So what we've done, what the Millennium Project has done, say in the case of the Middle East, is that they developed some Middle East peace scenarios by, again, going through this real-time Delphi process, coming up with some scenarios and publishing those and translating them into multiple languages so that various parties that are influence that region could read them. And as a result of that, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood modified some of their views on certain issues, at least long enough to
the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
To make a regime change there, or a change in government there. Now, the last several weeks, maybe we might wonder what happened to that, but at least it was enough to get them to agree to work with some other groups long enough to get a change.
But do we know that they really changed their position, or maybe they're saying we can make more progress by pretending that we're willing to live peacefully with you?
That's a very Machiavellian viewpoint, and I totally get what you're aiming at. And just to be sort of playing the devil's advocate, for a better choice of words, it is quite true that the various factions involved, and I won't go into all that complexity, it's much more a person than I am, but they will use the media for their own purposes. So I mean, what do you believe is the real intent versus how are they actually using the media engines to suit their purposes? But I think the Millennium Project is sort of a neutral ground, and that's why it's so interesting, because we're not like pushing any one particular viewpoint. It's just saying, come here and express the things that might be of relevance to your position. And so hopefully it's like a petri dish for a zone of neutrality, so that people can say, this is the stuff that we want to see done, and then out the other end comes potential solution sets or whatever.
Has it gained any traction?
Well, we recently we're working on a proposal for another conflict. I probably shouldn't say anything until we actually get the project, but the government agencies that we talked to in this particular region of the world that were very interested in the way the Middle East peace scenarios turned out, and they've asked us to put together a proposal to do a similar project in that region of the world. So some people recognize that there is a value to that, and at least getting that peace process started.
Now, in the Middle East particularly, a lot of the conflicts are religious conflicts. What do you bring to the table regarding that?
Well, I think it's a recognition that it's not just religious conflicts. There are other issues at play. There's food, there's water, there's all sorts of other historical issues. There are other players who are influencing what happens there. So I think it's getting them to recognize that it's probably never just a religious issue, that there are a lot of other issues that if you could get them to agree on the importance of those issues, that the religious issue becomes less important.
And if I may interject, just because of my own personal bias in these areas, I think the religion is actually used as a kind of a tool to push people's emotional buttons, as it were, to actually inflame or to create more tension that doesn't really have to exist. And I think especially a lot of younger people, they're not that bent on which religion is it. They're more bent on, can we actually feed our families, or can we look for a future that has education, that sort of thing. So you have some of the religious sort of oligarch types trying to cling to these rigid religious concepts as a control mechanism to hopefully get their little empire built or whatever it is. But then at the other end of the spectrum, you have ordinary people to say, I just want to live and have a better life. And so maybe this, at a kind of a threshold point, can these religious extremes be less relevant than the actual sort of everyday person's world in that context?
Well, there's an awful lot of violent rhetoric. I mean, there are cultures where people are explicitly taught to hate the other side.
Of course, and that's
been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years.
And that's like a propaganda system that is perhaps, hopefully, starting to dissipate, because as mostly these kinds of totalitarian religious, sort of what I call fanatical religious systems, take hold where there's isolation, where people have been forced to sort of believe only one thing, and they don't have any other access except that. Now that we live in this sort of transcendental media world, a lot of people are saying, well, wait a second now, there is another world out there. And in other words, I think that's why there's so much of this conflict going on, because people fear losing their power. They've used these fanatical religious concepts to control their little chunk of the land or the tribal entities they're supposedly dominating. And they're finding out that unless they keep that fanatical religious process going, they're going to lose out. They're not going to be the grand, sort of ruler of their little domain. So there's a lot of interest in trying to preserve these fanatical beliefs versus ordinary people who just say, look, can't we just live and sort this out? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of these have multiple layers of historical issues on top of them. So colonial issues that go back. Yeah. You have, certainly from recent decades, the socialist, communist political viewpoint versus the capitalist viewpoint. So all of these layers of history and different types of conflicts are put on top of this supposedly religious issue. And I think a lot of these things are, it's hard to pull and tease one out of the other, and you need to recognize all of them.
Religion has quite a powerful force. I mean, there are many people who will die for their religion. There are not that many people who will give their lives for modern liberalism, for example. And if you're willing to die for your cause and your opponent is not willing to die for his cause, you have a big advantage.
And some people want to maintain that because it's a very easy, simple, low-cost tool to sort of get your way. In other words, the people who die in the street think they're going to get their virgins or something, and they're just expendable. But there's people above them, of course, that like to use that for their own purposes. And I think that process may be, hopefully, dissipating as media processes and sort of access to an outside world becomes more commonplace.
Well, do you think that the desire to dominate is a basic aspect of human life? I mean, what are the things that drive human behavior? The desire to raise yourself above others, to rule others by force, seems to be pretty attractive for some people.
For some people, and I think that's a very tribalistic mechanism that's been around for many thousands of years, but we're living in a different time. So people are beginning to recognize that unless you abandon that tribal mechanism that was successful in a certain context, in a kind of an evolutionary scale, we're crossing into a threshold where it's not going to work anymore. you're going to have to, like it or not, figure out ways to cooperate. Otherwise, all bets are off.
And I think that's why the Millennium Project tries to identify all of these other issues and get people to agree on some other more fundamental basic things. And again, push this unresolvable conflict to the edges so that you may never resolve that issue. Yeah. But if you can get enough of the issues resolved that you can at least have peace and at least create an economy that's self-sustaining and lifts all boats, then I think you'll find a lot of the reason that people follow these religious precepts, or at least politically, will fall away. At least that's the goal. That's the challenge I think that we have. And
what about identity, like national identity? Like some people say, well, the whole human race has to learn to work together as a whole. And some people say, I don't identify with people who live in certain countries. I'm willing to work cooperatively with the people in my tribe to advance the benefits to my tribe, but all of the other tribes are my competitors.
Well, the concept of sovereignty is a very, very complex sort of a holographic world by itself. And I personally talk a lot about personal sovereignty, and I look at things like, food sovereignty is like a separate issue and things kind of things. But the whole idea of saying this is my flag and this is my religious symbol and therefore I must die for it and kill anybody else that intrudes upon it. As I said, this is a very sort of stuck in the mud with no potential for progress past the point we're at now. It's almost like a cliff, and if we don't get over that cliff and kind of figure out a different way to glide on with our hang glider or something, it's not going to work.
When those people start acquiring nuclear weapons, it gets kind of serious.
It gets a little more serious, that's true. but actually, as one who actually worked in a nuclear weapons lab, I can tell you from direct experience, it's a major concern. If I had to blurt out my personal thoughts for what I think is the most dangerous thing around the corner, it's probably going to be something biological. I don't really think nuclear weapons are that big of a deal.
Biological weapons?
Either something biological weapons or something that simply sprouts up because of an accident, and that's very likely, or things that have mutated because of strange agricultural practices, which I could elaborate on if you wish. But the whole idea of recombinant proteomics, synthetic biology, sort of this intersection between nanotech and biotech and being able to really construct organisms from scratch, this is all done. I mean, it's out of the box. It's not something hidden away in a lab. It's being spread throughout the world. And for good or for bad, or for better or worse, these are powerful tools. But can these tools be badly abused? I would say yes. However, can they also solve a lot of problems? The answer is yes. And as I often describe in some of my talks, I sort of show a graph that says, here's what I call the spiritual maturity index of our civilization, and here's the technology spike. It's almost like a vertical line. So theoretically, we should try to bring those lines a little closer together.
Well, it looks like there are two trends. There's one trend of people identifying with humanity as a whole and trying to unite. And then there's another trend leading toward increasing fragmentation. Do you have a sense of which trend is gaining the advantage over the other?
It depends on who you ask, and that's partly why the Millennium Project does what it does, because it wants to find that out.
Well, I think there's also, some of the fragmentation is based on a lot of other things besides religion or ethnic affinity. We use online social networks to allow people to form virtual tribes globally. So you have diasporas of various kinds where these people are able to, for religious or ethnic reasons, they're able to link to each other and feel part of a global network of people, and that actually has probably some positive benefits. But you also find people who are forming virtual tribes around other things like types of technology or things that relate to the type of work that they do. And so I think in some sense the fragmentation may actually get bigger, but that in and of itself links them to humanity as a whole, because the whole system
people have more of a choice of who they want to connect to. They're driven more by where their passions are and what actually makes sense to them, as opposed to what they've been told to believe through some kind of dogma lens, as it were.
And this is a great topic, which I'd love to continue on, but I also want to get to the topic of sustainable agriculture, which is another one of the 15 challenges.
Right.
Now, you're the co-founder of a company called General Hydroponics.
That's correct.
What's going on in the world of sustainable agriculture right now?
Well, and thank you for the opportunity. This is a paper I actually wrote a little while ago, just to read you the title. It's Water, How Can Everyone Have Sufficient Clean Water Without Conflict? And I sort of go into a very brief synopsis. This was actually for the State of the Future 2011 book that we published.
So the Millennium Project puts out a report like that every year?
Yeah, a series of reports, and all kinds of people from all over the world actually participate. And I was just Brock and I both participate and submit these kinds of ideas. So I've been at this for a long time, even though my background came out of lasers and optics and nanomaterials and electronics and all these other things, a lot of which was military and Dartmouth.
Well, several decades ago, there was something called the Green Revolution
that's right,
to increase crop yields in underdeveloped countries.
Yeah.
I gather we're moving further along.
Much further. And so the point I was hoping to get at was, even though up until just a few years ago I was, very much involved in Silicon Valley investors and combining with new electronics and other kinds of materials, I really had this sort of passion about, could we reorient these same breakthroughs in nanostructured materials and electronics and sensors and et cetera, but apply it to botany or to
farming. So you're applying nanotechnology to biotechnology.
In a sense, but in a very positive way. And this probably sounds scary to some, but here's where I'm going with this. First of all, I'm going to describe hydroponics. Hydroponics means growing without the use of soil. And so what that provides you is a way to have like this room could actually produce as much biomass as a farm 10 times the size if it was done correctly. But much more importantly, you use much less water because the water is constantly recirculated. And by carefully controlling the exact ratios of different nutrients and the pH and other factors, you can, almost like with the fine-tuning of a dial, you can tell exactly, and I mean doing exactly, what nutrient values are going to come out of the things you're trying to grow, whether it's a type of root or a fruit or a leafy vegetable, and you can have all different things sort of mixed together in the same amount of space. The advantage is that now you don't have to rely on large-scale monocrop farming. You can bring farming down to sort of almost like microeconomics meets farming, kind of in a way of modeling this concept.
I understand that we have a few slides which illustrate your work. Can we see the first slide, please? Okay, so what are we looking at here?
This is just one of the major greenhouses. We actually have several sites, but this is our site up in Sebastopol. And we've done a lot of work up there for many, many years. I actually was not involved with the company for some time. I was really working in nanomaterials and photonics and electronic systems and so forth, but went back recently and kind of picked up where I left off. And so we have a laboratory there. I mean, we grow things and we test out different nutrient systems.
And what are we looking at here?
Okay, so this is actually one of our, we call it the Hexapod. And we work with UC Davis, of course, which is nearby. And so we have, our whole idea is to have these interchangeable component systems so that you can have different kinds of crops growing in the same physical space. You can have seedlings that grow at different rates. You can have different kinds of plants. And the whole idea is to come up with solution sets that can be adapted to wherever you might happen to be in a different part of the world, maybe where the quality of water is different or a certain range of crops are more advantageous to a particular situation.
Let's see the next slide.
Okay, this is just an example of how...
It looks like there's wires going to those plants.
Well, it's holding them up. It's the whole idea is the amount of biomass. Notice how small the containers are versus the size of biomass. It's kind of astonishing. People walk in and they don't believe what they're looking at. It doesn't make it, like, there's a root ball this big, but it's this plant that's 10 feet tall and it weighs 30 pounds. How is that possible? And the reason is because the plants are not spending a lot of effort and energy searching for nutrients in the soil. It's almost like intravenous feeding. The solution is brought right to them. So the energy is not put in root development, it's put into plant development.
And I think the next and final slide illustrates that a little bit.
And there it is. This is a classic shot. There's Larry Brook, who actually is the other co-founder. This goes back a number of years. But we have gone way beyond this. This was kind of an earlier version. If you notice these rectangular tubes with the holes, and they have the little mounts, they're cocoa fiber mounts actually that go inside. We have quite a variety of all different kinds of interchangeable systems. I mean, we're just going through various different hardware platforms.
Is there any kind of theoretical limit as to how much food you can produce in a given area? Is there some gating factor?
There are gating factors, and this is one of the things that really gets me excited. That's kind of why I plunged back into this, because I see here in this country, especially in like Detroit and some other areas, but also just elsewhere in the world, you have cities filled with empty buildings. You have parking lots. You've got roofs of apartment houses, this kind of thing. I see farmland. And people used to laugh at this idea 10 years ago. They're not laughing now. It's kind of interesting. In fact, to maybe look at the economic side, there's a bunch of different journals. There's Agribusiness Weekly and so forth. And one of the articles that really kind of leaped off the page was there was actually an analysis of the amount of money spent on what's called microfarm technology or applications. Back in 2005, it was under $500 million. There was about $400 million total expenditures in the microfarming world. As of fiscal year 2012, that changed to $11.2 billion.
Is it possible? Is it possible for an apartment dweller to grow all of his own food in his apartment?
I think it's quite possible for a building to grow a variety of crops that everybody could benefit from. And that's the kind of model I think makes the most sense. Rather than having one person grow one thing, it's really more like a collective concept. And
there's some other economic concepts that are being balanced when we look at these concepts. One is, as we look at the growth of the population over the next few decades, we see not only projections for big population growth, going to 9 billion people by 2050 in the world, but also a lot of that growth, most of that growth, will be in urban areas. So there's a big question about how to get food from farmland to those people, and to what extent that the economic cost of that can be offset by actually growing at least a certain percentage of the food in the cities themselves. And whether that's more energy efficient, makes use of real estate in a different way, makes use of water in a different way. So those things are certainly driving some of this interest now as well, as opposed to when the population was more spread out across.
And there's a concept called vertical farming. There's even some books called vertical farming. Should have brought one along, I'm sorry I didn't. But 5 years ago, this was kind of like an interesting concept. Now it's like people are actually doing this literally in Italy, France, Korea, Japan, certain parts of the United States. I mean, there's actual money being spent on, can we turn this building into an actual farm? And what's interesting is the amount of stuff that's produced is not only larger than in a traditional open field farm, but it's actually much higher quality. And if I can tie just a couple of threads together, since after all we do look at problems in a holographic concept, here's maybe an example. If you look at the cost of healthcare, if you look at the number one downward driver of most of the major economies of the world is the cost of healthcare. It's the top list.
I'm afraid we're going to have to stop right there because I've just gotten the signal we're out of time. I'd like to thank my two guests, Brock Hinzmann, Charles Ostman from the Millennium Project, excuse me. Thank you for watching. Visit our website, www.futuretalk.net. For Future Talk, I'm Marty Wasserman. See you next time.